Oops. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Marin, and I am a argument and research specialist at the Debate Critique. Today, we're learning about the University K, also the undercommons, a couple other things, but we'll get there. So let me get to the second slide. Cool. So our objectives for today. The first, what is the University K? What's the university? Who is writing, reading, and running this critique? And why are they doing it? Where are they doing it? Kind of the who, what, where, when, why, etc. How do you go for it? How do you answer it on both the AF and the neg against various kinds of AFs and from various literature bases? So we'll start with kind of the big picture question. What is the university? Who is critiquing it? And why are they doing that? So the university is a lot of things. A lot of people say that debate is the university structure, i.e. I am in a Binghamton classroom right now. That's definitely the university. But critical theorists for a long time have had a lot of really hot takes about what the university is and what that means, and especially what that means for labor and knowledge production. Oops. So I want you to take a moment, maybe pause the lecture, ask yourself what the university means for you. A couple examples that we'll kind of go over, or maybe we won't quite get to, are theorists that view the university as a structure that commodifies and productivizes knowledge, or potentially a reflection of anti-Black structures in society. There's also critiques that call the university an ivory tower, or a part of the military-industrial complex. I would argue that, like other institutions, the university was not only created by systems of power, but was created with the explicit intent to preserve, protect, and reproduce those systems, which includes the university, but also the state, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, even larger structures like ontological structures of anti-Black racism or settler colonialism. So who is making these critiques? Why are they doing it? I mean, I feel like the why is pretty clear. You know, we've isolated a structure of power that does bad things to people, creates problems. So that would probably be a good reason to critique that structure. There are a lot of literature bases that have critiques of the academy, things like queer death studies, which is an offshoot of queer theory that's kind of new. There's also critical race theory, disability theory, Maoism actually has its own critique. So the structures and critiques that we're going to focus on today are semiotics, kind of the undercommons, a little bit more like Deleuzian, and settler colonialism, and the way that they approach knowledge production and the academy and how those things work in debate. So we are starting with semiotics. We'll focus on Baudrillard, Ingrid, and we'll talk about the anarchist news evidence. So I am going to read off the slide, I know, just so you have a minute to think about kind of what Baudrillard is saying here. So, cipher, do not decipher, work over the illusion, create illusion to create an event, make enigmatic what is clear, render unintelligible what is only too intelligible, make the event itself unreadable, accentuate the false transparency of the world to spread a terroristic confusion about it, or the germs and viruses of a radical illusion, in other words, a radical disillusioning of the real. Viral, pernicious thought, corrosive of meaning, generative of an erotic perception of reality's turmoil. So this is a pretty common Baudrillard quote, you know, cipher, do not decipher. But he's making a very salient point here about information and knowledge, which kind of leads very easily into the university or the academy, which Baudrillard views as a site of knowledge production, kind of an acceleration of signs and signifiers of reality via publishing and research, and academia as a whole exists basically to create more of those things. And so kind of contained within Baudrillard's critique of language and information in general, and then particularly within the academy critique, he's talking a lot about avoiding the need to use knowledge or information to make the world make sense, to make things clear or transparent. So in that way, that's kind of exactly how he approaches academic structures of knowledge production. So it's hard to separate Baudrillard's general critique from the academy K, because again, he's focused on linguistics, and within language, if you study linguistics, within language is how meaning and reality are generated. And so with the academy being a structure that exists really just to generate more information, more meaning, more knowledge. His entire critique is kind of centered around the academy, particularly within debate, which is within the academy itself. So I took Baudrillard and kind of separated his theory into three primary ideas. So I will kind of go through each of those, some more general things, and then we'll move on to anarchist news. So the first idea is the will to transparency, which you'll often see, well, all three of these you'll often see read as like kind of a DA on case, this is the will to transparency DA. So much as it says on the slide, this is the need, the like kind of drive to take a world that is unclear, that does not make sense, and make sense of it, to define it and put it into terms that allow it to be clarified. And so that is really the object of academic research, is to take the things we do not know and allow us to know them. So there are plenty of implications of this. A common one is ressentiment, so like this project is impossible. There's also the idea that reality itself is not meant to be understood in this way, that not only is it impossible, but that process becomes violent as we try to define things that don't exist or are beyond understanding. So this kind of leans into the will to meaning, which is the second idea. This is a little bit more rooted to the capacity of language or information to signify or to kind of give meaning to something that is intrinsically meaningless. So as it says on the slide, the academy, of course, does this as well. So the will to meaning has a lot to do with value, with kind of importance, like assigning importance to things, and also correlating that importance to the productive capacity of ideas. So we have to give things meaning to give them value, to make them things that are worth having in the first place. So for instance, if there is an international crisis, why do we have to write about that? Why do we have to give that meaning, signification, to integrate it into our reality structure? So this kind of ties to the will to productivity. They're very similar to each other because productivity is why meaning is something that we consider to be important. And so this form of productivization is intrinsically violent. First, because this allows systems of power to decide what kind of meaning and what kind of information has productive capacity. And that kind of plays into the second part, which is that translates onto bodies, individuals, and identities. So this is a really common critique. Well, I guess maybe not this framing, but this idea is really common in critical disability studies. The idea that an individual's value is premised off of their productive capacity, and that lack, in air quotes, of course, of productive capacity devalues the disabled subject. So here, the idea that information and academia exist to generate meaning, it allows the value of those things to be premised based on what the academy considers to be productive. And so that also edges out alternative forms of knowledge production, which we'll get to a little bit more in some of the other literature bases. So the last one is the will to order. Again, these are all very interrelated, but this gets a little bit more into categorization and kind of the way that knowledge has to be formulated to be able to exist within the academy. So we are staring a completely chaotic unreality in the face, and to respond to that by attempting to impose very static and like identifiable delineated categories onto knowledge and information is firstly a will to order, in that we are afraid of chaos. And secondly, that system to order that chaos is also, again, incredibly violent in terms of the kind of identity groups that we talked about with the will to meaning. So what happens when something cannot be ordered or resists being ordered? Inevitably, if our system is one that requires order, those things will either have to be assimilated or will have to be wiped out. And so that is, in disability theory, the killer-cure logic. In kind of Semiotics and Baudrillard, we talk about, like a false choice between conformity or genocide, sometimes described as like to be killed in a non-spectacular event. So these are Baudrillard's like key concepts. There are a couple other things that are relevant specifically surrounding the critique of the university. So the first is debate as an information economy, so that things like the topic and research exist as a form of the production and exchange of knowledge and information as a commodity. So we accumulate, like hundreds and hundreds of pages of information, of files with evidence in them, but those things are only valuable in that they can be exchanged, that they are productive, and that they give us something like the ballot or good speaker points, right? And not only is that delegitimizing to kind of the things that we talk about, so we might say like charity cannibalism, so we have to profit off of like these images of suffering, or war pornography, but also this plays into Baudrillard's kind of thesis claim that information is dissuasive, so that like we can collect as much knowledge as we want, and that's not going to change people's minds. A good example of this is like a K-debater can have 10 million framework rounds in a row. I have seen hundreds and hundreds of framework arguments and cards and evidence and information. I'm not persuaded because I can find an equal amount of information that says the exact opposite. And that's part of the problem of academia's kind of obsession with accumulating information, is that eventually you have justifications for everything. And so you have a justification for nothing. Also, this like process of informationalizing things that is kind of intrinsic to academia and to research is the process of reducing reality to information, or I guess hyperreality to information. And this is another key kind of linguistics concept that Baudrillard is building on, which is that the process of turning ideas, reality, experiences into language requires that some of that information is lost in the process. So for instance, like I'm holding a water bottle. I can't really see it because I've got a virtual background going, but my hand and the water bottle are two different objects, and I can describe that in a million different ways. So for instance, I might say, my hand has acrylics. The water bottle does not have acrylics. The water bottle makes a fun shaky noise when I shake it. My hand does not do that, right? And I could probably list these forever. But even though I have an infinite number of ways to describe those differences, there is an infinitely larger number of ways that I don't have the ability to explain in language. That loss is one of the things that Baudrillard is critiquing when he says that like reality cannot be explained via representations. And the process of informationalization that's kind of intrinsic to the academy requires that experiences are filtered down into something that is consumable and palatable, not only via like the Enlightenment era guidelines of academic professionalism or reality, but also just in the act of putting those things into language itself. All right, so we're gonna go on and talk about the anarchist news evidence. I'll move out of the way so you can read the meme for a second, just in case anyone didn't know, that is when the Gulf War happened. Well, or did it? Anyway, let's talk about the anarchist news. So a first kind of caveat, I don't know, a common answer is that the anarchist news evidence was written for debate. Firstly, sure, but also that just makes it more accurate, contextualized to the space, and also doesn't automatically make it wrong. Another great answer to this is that so are a lot of framework cards. And in any case, even if it was written for debate, if information is dissuasive and knowledge doesn't exist anyway, then like, doesn't matter. I don't know. The anarchist news evidence is kind of the most explicit explanation of the way that Baudrillard has critiqued the academy. And then there's a little bit more at the end about zombie politics. So first is the idea that the university kind of hides behind Enlightenment ideas to serve as a consolidation machine for privilege. So that privilege becomes concentrated in the academy as a necropolis, or kind of a tower of death, which is kind of an adventure of a phrase, but that's okay. So this kind of creates an image of what the academy is, that it is something that seeks to maintain and is a part of a Western, educated, stable society. And this process, not only of creating the academy, but of maintaining it and of creating knowledge, requires labor exploitation. Not just the act of labor exploitation that is like intrinsic to writing and research, but also like who makes our computers? Who mines for the pieces of our computers, the internal pieces? What happens to those people? Where do they live? How are they impacted by the academy? Like, does the academy acknowledge that those people exist in the first place? I mean, usually not. And so that reality is just another layer of the ways in which the academy requires not only exploitation, but violence to continue to propagate knowledge and information that's useless in the first place. The next thing that the anarchist news evidence, like this version of the critique, does is define social death. So Baudrillard and kind of any postmodern or existentialist author is making a claim that there is an intrinsic lack in reality, in our experience of reality, in meaning. So like Nietzsche might say that God is dead, i.e. the idea that we can have an overarching understanding of reality or meaning or value cannot be true, does not exist, is violent somehow. So under this theorization, social death is seeing that lack of reality and allowing institutions like the state, the academy, etc., to fill those missing pieces in, and in that way kind of inform how we relate to the world, how we understand the real, how we understand the subject, how we understand life, all of these things, to allow those things to be defined for us and to kind of be controlled. So the evidence gets into an explanation of something that is like the event. And it says kind of that the event comes at the peak, at like kind of the moment at which the academy reaches the perfect explanation of reality, the totalizing definition. We have created like the story of reality, that in that moment the university creates its own antithesis in which that which has been deemed socially dead does not stay dead. You have a zombie politics. So the argument that this evidence is making is that we should not exclude the dead, but instead reclaim them as the living dead and eat the system alive. So I'm sure you can see how we end up going for death good quite a bit with this argument. But also there's kind of a more nuanced understanding of what death means in relation to an academy structure that is allowed to define kind of identity groups or certain types of knowledge production as being invaluable, or I guess that actually is the opposite of what I mean, as being not valuable, or as kind of representing a lack of sociality, being unpalatable, or being dead. And so reclaiming those things and allowing them to consume the system itself is kind of the answer that is provided to us. All right, so the next kind of critique that we're going to talk about is a really good segue into our next section, which is the undercommons with Moten, Harney, Deleuze, and Guattari. So we're going to talk about Ingrid Hooft, who has a critique of speed elitism and academia. If you're interested in this, I would look up Virilio, who talks a lot more about speed elitism, but in this case, we'll stick with Hooft, who's a little bit more contextualized to the authors that we're talking about and a little bit more common in debate space. So under Hooft's definition, the academy is kind of intrinsically tied to the military industrial complex specifically. So not just like the systems of meaning and knowledge or like particular power structures, but this one power structure, and serves as a mechanism to justify things like military interventions and imperialism and hegemony. And it does those things via the key phrases that I've put on the slide. So techno-scientific rationality, enlightenment myths of an objective human subject, and then charity cannibalism is kind of within those things. So I'll start with techno-scientific rationality, which is the framing of technology as good, of Western science as something that is like positive, creates progress via, like advancements in things like medical technology or military technology or democracy, like the idea that the United States is this great, amazing, progressive, like liberal God, that democracy is something that should be brought everywhere. And what's very important is that not only is this information being like kind of accumulated and disseminated, but also that this structure exists to create kind of an understanding that this kind of information coming from this particular system is the best, that our research articles, that our information, which just happens to say how great the US is way more valid than everybody else is. And so it kind of it attempts to create an echo chamber where not only is this the only information we can listen to, but that this just happens to say that we are the best, which probably also means that you should listen to us anyway, etc., forever. And so this justifies imperialism in that, so this justification of imperialism is pretty intrinsic, i.e. we create information that says that the US military does good things, amazing things for people, creates democracy, that our interventions are justified, that they're better than other interventions, etc., and that we have to be the global police officers. We need to bring democracy to other places, So it's kind of easy to see how that works to allow us to continue to do these things, because not only are we writing this kind of information, but hopefully, and I say hopefully from the perspective of, hegemony in the academy, hopefully other people are reading it and buying into it. And so it also increases kind of international perception of the US. So the second piece of this is the human subject. So the Enlightenment era myth of the human subject is just the idea that there is one like definable ideal person. This is pretty common in other literature bases as well. This is talked about a lot in race theory, also disability theory, queer theory. And so as this myth is propagated, this also works to justify imperialism, but also things like dehumanization, otherization, genocide. And it kind of roots back to that idea that you can conform or you can be killed in a non-spectacular event. So you can accept that, like the US's idea of what a perfect person is correct, and you can become a good, hardworking, democratic American or American adjunct and pay your taxes and support the war machine, or you can be genocided. And those are really the kind of two options. So the last thing on here is charity cannibalism, which is just the idea that in its informationalization via the academy, so in being recorded and written and turned into knowledge as an object, that the narrative itself is consumed, that the object of that narrative has to be objectified, right? Because you must have an object for that object to be consumed in a linguistic sense. And then that those things not only allow the academy to profit, but also kind of give the academy the image of being this good, progressive, again, liberal institution, which, creates space for narratives of pain and suffering and allows people to share their stories, when in reality, those stories are relatively being ignored, but being used to shield the academy from criticism and from the reality of its inefficacy and even propagation of systems of violence. So there are kind of two-ish, and I will say two, but I'm sure that it will not be two by the time I'm done. There are a few implications of this, and kind of answers to it. The first is that one should resist the need to accelerate the production of information. I mean, if information is dissuasive and reality is fake anyway, then this is a pretty easy claim to buy. But also just the idea that we need to keep researching or keep creating files full of evidence doesn't really make sense if you've bought into any of these critiques. The next is be wary of identity politics. And this kind of comes back to the charity cannibalism point. So the speakability and visibility that are intrinsic to, again, informationalization allows first for targeting of potentially oppressed populations, and also allows for that information to be co-opted and then used. So this is common also in Robin James's kind of semiotic critique of performativity, in that the amazing, piece of academic literature that has now been written about a particular form of violence against a particular group now becomes the next big thing, how great is the academy for giving this person a space to speak? And within Robin James's critique, that has a lot of other implications that I won't get into now, but she does also have a very kind of fleshed out acknowledgement of this. So that is the first thing, be wary of identity politics. The next thing takes Baudrillard's idea that the Gulf War did not happen, i.e. it happened in the media, and kind of expands. So yeah, sure, it was a war of kind of television and information, but it was also analyzed and accelerated and considered, and brought in to political spaces. And those things happen in the academy. We write essays, we write research papers, we do analyses. And that only allows us, or not us, I suppose, but the military industrial complex, the government, et cetera, to expand on the potential productive capacity of those interventions, because now we're selling books and we're improving our international image. And that is what kind of comes down to this consumption of the narrative, which is that hyper-liberal spaces like the academy will do exactly that, and they will extract, co-opt, and exploit the academic labor potential to feed this sentimental fantasy of a wonderful Enlightenment era productive university. And this is a really good segue because this is the point at which Hooft starts really citing Moten and Harney. So I'm gonna put a pause on that for now, and we're gonna move on to the undercommons. So I know I just said Moten and Harney, but we're actually gonna start with D and G. So I'll do the thing again, I'll read the quote so you have a second to think about it, and just know this is not from like primary source D&G, it's somebody writing about them, but I thought it kind of did a very good job of kind of encapsulating what exactly they were trying to say. So, the writing academic mind bodies leak emotions, materialities, fluids, and uncertainties to the neoliberalist outcome-oriented academic writing machines. They contest the idea of academia as a molar structure that works on rational logic by allowing vitality, porosity, and leakiness to transform academic writing practices. So I want to stop for a second and talk about molarity. Almost said morality. That's how you know I've been reading too much Nietzsche. Anyway, so this is the question of molar versus, all right, I did in fact have to make sure that the word that I picked was correct. So, but we got there. So molar versus molecular formations of power. So, and also like of identity, kind of just like a method of organizing knowledge. So a molar formation, sorry for those of you who have taken chemistry and desperately wanted to avoid ever hearing that phrase again, is a collection of molecules. It is a certain weight that can kind of be used as a unit of measurement, but it works in combination or an aggregation of those molecules. However, Deleuze and Guattari have critiqued the idea that we can ignore the molecular differences. And so instead of having a molar formation of reality within academia, we should instead understand it molecularly or as kind of a connection or a relationality between different kinds of knowledge production, different kinds of ideas, and kind of the ways that they relate and have their own vitality as they move along lines of flight ever further towards the exterior, etc. So, Deleuze and Guattari, the vibes. So their understanding of the academy is pretty basic in relation to what we've talked about. You know, the academy requires the privatization and productivization of labor and thought. So their kind of unique take on this is that the academy requires those things to be territorialized for use by the state. So this idea of territorialization is very similar to the will to order, and you will see those things used together. And that is largely because the will to order kind of comes from Nietzsche, and Deleuze and Guattari are writing kind of as a continuation of those ideas. But the idea that there are distinct, what are called Kantian lines that can be used to distinguish between clear and static categories of things like identity, politics, information, knowledge, etc. And so we've already talked about how like the process of needing to and of trying to sort those things into distinct categories is often violent and kind of intrinsically violent in the way that it requires those things to signify only in a way that has been designated as allowable, as palatable or productive by structures of power. And that is, the productivity question is very important here because these lines within the academy exist so that this information can be useful to power structures like the state, the military industrial complex, etc. So I want to talk for a second about labor exploitation a little bit more specifically here. So the quote that we just talked about, the idea of messy leaking bodies, those bodies are those that are creating academia, that are creating research. And so there are individuals within the academy that are not allowed to take up space there, that their labor is expected, their productivity is required. You know, we have to have people writing about Asian American studies and critical race theory, and those people must exist within the academy, but they are not allowed to kind of be recognized or to be seen as equally productive, even as they must exist there. And then of course, within those spaces and kind of within those that are considered messy leaking bodies, again, air quotes, that if you violate that kind of rigidity of territorialization, you are discarded, because value can only be derived via productive capacity, which is then filtered through kind of a lens of permissive individualism, which is a little bit more Baudrillardian, but not something that we talked about, but kind of the idea that there is a certain amount of resistance or of independent thought that we are allowed to do, that we're expected to do, but that if we move beyond that, that is when, you know, the state structure or the university structure starts to have problems. So like, we can hold a peaceful protest, mostly depending on who we are and what we're protesting, but we cannot riot, right? That is the point at which our permissive individualism has gone too far for the university. And that absolutely exists within academia and kind of knowledge production. We can write critiques of the state. We cannot write, you know, like direct directions, love that, on, you know, how to build a bomb, or like why certain particular people should be assassinated. Like at that point, we've gone too far. And at that point, like the academy and kind of the state see that our value is no longer like useful to them. And this is used even more insidiously against particular groups with particular kinds of knowledge production. So we'll get there with settler colonialism when we talk about that, but just like the way that those things are regarded. And then, so the answer to this is kind of the undercommons, which we'll get to on the next slide. But before we do that, I want to look at these questions. So the first is, who is allowed to be in academia unquestioned and why? And what kind of knowledge are those people producing? So like, I can go and do like chemistry research as a like white woman, and outside of like potential things about women going into STEM fields and doing STEM research, I generally am producing something that's considered to be productive, that is in line with the technoscientific rationalist goals of the state, right? So why is that more productive? Why is that more unquestionable than something like a disabled individual writing a critique of the way that the university is inaccessible? And that brings us to the next question, which is, which fields are respectable and what do they research? Who's doing it? And so you'll find that we believe things, maybe not us, but we tend to believe things, the impersonal we, that things like identity theory or critical theory, that these things are less real or less material than things like chemistry or international relations as a field of study. And that is not because like the lived experiences and the realities of those individuals are any less real or material, but instead that it is a lot more convenient for the state if we think of these things as abstract and unimportant. And, you know, we laugh at people who get philosophy degrees or like gender studies degrees because those things are not productive, or, you know, you won't be able to get a job. But this is just another moment in which like the territorialization of the academy and kind of the way that value is derived from productive potential is incredibly violent, because it is not intrinsically derived from productive, or it is not derived from what is intrinsically productive, but instead what kinds of productivity exist in a way that is beneficial to structures of power. And so in the abstract, like to write a paper takes the same, to think of Marx, the same amount of like labor hours relatively. And the implications of that might be equally material depending on who you are and what paper you're reading. So instead of stopping people from writing, certain types of knowledge production are considered illegitimate or unproductive, so that we don't consider what they could mean for individuals who are experiencing them. So we'll get a little bit more into the alternative. Another quote from Moten: "Can you be a person? Can you have a story? Can you have rights? Can you do right without a state?" So that quote is from a piece on undercosmopolitanism, which is a little bit different than the undercommons, but relatively the same. It's kind of the application of that critique to international relations. So you can kind of take that quote in the same way, but in relation to the academy. Can we have knowledge? Can we have written histories and stories and research and articles and writings? Can we have those things without the academy? What does it mean to have them without the academy? Are they less valuable? Why are they less valuable, right? Like, what does it mean for the academy as a structure to have a monopoly on legitimate knowledge production? Okay. So of the explanations of what the university is, Moten and or Harney, sometimes Harney, their take on the university is definitely the most kind of unique one that we've seen so far. So everybody else has talked about privatization of knowledge and the productivization of knowledge, and they instead consider the university as kind of the most modern instantiation of carcerality. So that this system, the academic system, exists to racialize, criminalize, and contain and control the mechanisms of thought and knowledge and information that are kind of like relevant in society. And again, relevant in the kind of society that the academy would like us to have. So this would be the modern form of racialized labor commodification, and what we were just talking about, things like the lack of recognition, the lack of celebration, the idea that this labor must exist, that these theorists continue to exist and produce to allow the academy to exist the way that it does, to teach courses and to kind of prop these things up, but that labor is functionally stolen. And in that way, the academy becomes kind of an offshoot and a more modern instantiation of the carcerality that's intrinsic to systems like slavery, and kind of, again, the continuation of ontological systems of anti-Blackness within like structures and systems of power. So people go back and forth. Moten's not always kind of read in the way that we would think of ontology with things like pessimism, because Moten and also Deleuze are a lot more optimistic, particularly than Baudrillard's critique. Again, optimism and pessimism are words, so they're intrinsically reductive as to how deeply they're able to describe certain things, but understand kind of the optimism of things like the undercommons as refusing to be passive or to give up or to like kind of let go of sociality and the potential for relationality and production, that is like that those things are possible even with the system as it exists now. So Moten has kind of envisioned the university as another mechanism of command of the social that requires the socially dead to exist, but refuses to kind of integrate them into the system of power or into giving them like kind of command or control or any of these things, agency, etc. So this introduces a pretty important question, which is, where do we study Blackness and how does that implicate it, right? So if we are doing these studies in a university that is committed to, founded on the continuation of social death, like the hypervisibility and intelligibility of the Black subject, and like kind of the enforcement of the conditions of fungibility and like labor commodification, like doing that study there absolutely impacts the way that that study is conducted. And so instead, Moten proposes an undercommons, which is those who are in but not of, those who are not outside but underneath the university. And with undercosmopolitanism, it's the same kind of thing, but with like the state. So these individuals that have been denied kind of a place and a validity within academia, but are still there and are still producing. This is a move kind of to open the cartography or the geography of the academic labor economy to those who are of the university, but never within its Enlightenment paradigm of professionalism, of humanism, of Western rationality. So part of the undercommons is that it requires the university to encounter those people upon whose backs it was built via their exploitation. The teaching within this undercommons does not hold social capacity with the understanding that social capacity is kind of a violent process that is weaponized against those who are within the undercommons. That traditional academic labor is sclerotic. It sees only what is, but not what could be. And that the undercommons is kind of adopting Deleuze's ideas about relationality and lines of flight and molecularity as opposed to molarity, that the undercommons becomes a statelessness as a place of study, a place that is not confined or conformed for a Blackness that is always already moving and in movement and has been rendered fungible. So it is kind of outside of history and sovereignty and hegemony and statehood and self-determination and all of these things, because Blackness, as Moten has explained it, is outside of those things, but that it is moving, and that instead of allowing inauthenticity to be projected onto it by these structures, as is currently kind of the common practice, that we should reject authenticity as a standard in the first place, that we should allow ourselves to be like Deleuze's messy, leaking bodies and exist in a kind of moment of relationality with the understanding that like those standards that were kind of given to us and enforced on us are not the end all be all, that they are simply something that someone has decided on, and that we should reject their decision, and that we should reject the ability of others to make that decision for us at all. So that is my kind of summary of the undercommons, and we will move on to settler colonialism. Fun transition right there. So we'll mostly be talking about Tuck and Yang, but before we do, I'm going to do a little bit of history and epistemology. So there is a very long history in the United States of genocide, dehumanization, land stealing, treaty breaking in relation to indigenous subjects. I'm particularly going to talk about residential schools and the practice of cultural genocide. And there was going to be a picture of that, but that felt really disingenuous to the message kind of that's coming with this lecture. So instead, these are all of the indigenous groups that I could find that were kind of wiped out by the US or exist now like within the reservation system. And of course, there's always the question of like transcription and like the English language as like a mechanism for communication. But this did feel less, like substantially less violent than putting kind of like the before and after pictures of kind of the process of cultural evisceration that took place. So the quick kind of highlight in terms of epistemology here, epistemology being the study of knowledge production and dissemination, is that the first thing that the US government did after kind of stealing the land and doing the initial like intensely violent genocide that occurred was to literally kidnap children and send them to boarding schools and erase or do the best that they could to erase things like cultural tradition, religious practice, things like languages, you know, like students weren't allowed to speak their native languages, they weren't allowed to wear their hair in traditional styles, they weren't allowed to practice their religions. And in that way, kind of the intensity with which the genocide was carried out is kind of revealed in that the government's goal was not only to clear the land, but literally to remove the possibility that the people who were there first could even come together in like a unified way and be able to discuss what had happened, you know, like that language was lost, culture was lost, and that when those things are lost, the kind of depth to which this like complete and like intense violence had occurred is also lost, because what has been lost is gone. And so in that way, knowledge production and epistemology have been very central to the way that the United States federal government has carried out colonialism and expansion and, you know, the whole like frontierism. And so that makes the critique of the university very central to often the way that this is read, particularly again in the debate space. And so talked about residential schools and wardship programs. Okay, yeah. So the other key thing about this, and I guess I will move slides so that we can start talking about Tuck and Yang. But the important thing to take from kind of my very, very brief foray into history is that this is like the very process of knowledge production in the US and like of the public school system, of the university system, is premised on the evisceration of the other. It starts with like the act of removing culture and language and trying to enforce Christianity and kind of like Western values. That's where it starts. And so of course it must continue that way. That is its foundation, right? So within that, we get into kind of this critique. So Tuck and Yang are very commonly cited authors for these kinds of arguments. Their explanation is that the university is a nexus of the settler state. And as I've just described, the two functions that they talk about particularly are like the religious and cultural practices in which like the other is not just like, so in this case, we're talking about the other as like the indigenous subject, and that definition gets expanded on when we were talking about like Deleuze's messy leaking bodies, which I keep saying, in that like that which does not conform, right? The idea here is that the foundational picture of that which does not conform is the indigenous subject who had to be kind of assimilated via this structure. And again, had to be if you're the government, and generally awful and violent, I guess. So a couple other kind of key claims that are being made is that first, that means the university is beyond reform. It is premised on violence. There isn't a better university that could be created. Next is that the subaltern or indigenous groups are allowed in these spaces only to produce pain narratives or kind of explanations of suffering, and those must be palatable and productive. We have to be able to sell them and, you know, fill lecture halls to listen to them. And this is very limiting intentionally in terms of like kind of permissible expression within like indigenous communities via the university. So like, we'll kind of go back to this idea of authenticity, right? If the only form of authentic expression is that which is allowed within the university, the academy, and the only form of indigenous expression allowed within the academy is explanations of pain and suffering, that is a kind of tool in which the university is able to reduce the indigenous experience and culture into just violence and like that which has been done to the indigenous groups as well, which also removes kind of an understanding of agency, which is another piece in a long line of kind of the state working to remove that agency from indigenous folks. So critical projects, things like critical theory or reform, or I don't know, usually the undercommons is not considered as within critical projects because that is kind of foundationally against or underneath or without the university. But things like writings and lectures and kind of things that take the indigenous experience and fold it into what is palatable to this structure are part of the settler move to innocence. So this is another example of in which like the narrative consumes the object, and that in and of itself is also consumed. So like, look how great the university is. We've provided an amazing space to do X, Y, and Z. We should continue to do that because we're so great and wonderful. And that just kind of dissolves the responsibility for this intensely violent genocidal process from the university, the state, systems of power, etc. There's also the idea that academia requires the infinite reduction of bodies of color into information, and that reductive process is a move to delegitimize pain, suffering, genocide, imperialism. And again, that process of delegitimization allows the state to be rendered kind of blameless. And so we keep doing those things because they are considered to be okay by the academic structures that create that kind of determine how we interpret reality. All right, that is my slide. Debate. That's why we're all here, right? Okay, so I'm gonna kind of run through each of these things as an AF, like how the university critique might be contained within a potential AF, how to answer that, and what you might say in response. We'll talk about reading these on the neg as an answer. Yeah, so we'll start with Baudrillard. Topic link. Topic is the will to productivity, the accumulation of knowledge, right? That the topic requires us to signify, and that topicality is us like kind of creating reality via signification, via information. And so instead we should break down this process of information exchange within debates, sign economy, and create, for instance, my AF at CETA was we embraced Kamani's cry, death to America, as a terrorist singularity of a like symbolic death to the United States. I definitely did not quite say that as I meant to, but the idea that we should kind of use information to fight itself and kind of accelerate it into its own absurdity and particularly, and this is the key to the Academy K within this, is to refuse to invest in the productive potential of the debate space. So the idea that like the act of speaking these words into, you know, a round and to trade them for the ballot will not fix things. And pretending that they can is really violent for infinitely many reasons. So a couple answers to this that aren't just like author indicts and generic Baudrillard answers are that kind of the idea that academic language or like that knowledge production is redeemable or reformable or good or useful. So maybe it allows us to understand problems. It allows us to become good policymakers, etc. There's also the idea that the academy is inevitable. And so I say our because in my head I'm reading this AF, I don't know, that our like passive nihilism of the AF, or the idea that the AF is passive nihilism, becomes violent and cedes that space to people with bad and violent intentions. And that also there are sometimes arguments that like this form of an AF delegitimizes the labor of like theorists and the kind of the material implications that that might have. So like people are writing in the academy, and what does it mean to say that those things are like useless and that those things don't have material implications? The answer to this, outside of like kind of the anarchist news evidence just like in itself, is that we have to stop pretending that our words have the ability to make changes to this space. That like academic knowledge is not redeemable or reformable or good or useful because it doesn't exist. It is describing something that isn't real. And that is the answer to the labor argument as well. You do have to be careful how that argument is made, because there are theorists who are writing about very important things, at least in the context of not reading Baudrillard and believing that information is fake. So sometimes you have to bite really hard into like information is dissuasive, or charity cannibalism, which is I think, kind of a very good way to frame the implication that debate has on this kind of argument, i.e. the idea that reading a theorist's work in this space is somehow going to fix something or is somehow going to like stop some kind of violence, change the way that people think about the world, is not only like kind of a hollow hope, but also creates again this like consumption of the narrative via this hyperliberal university space. So like it trades off. Instead of going out and trying to fix these problems, we are saying words into a room or a Zoom call. And those words are not going to reach, you know, like any of the like war-stricken regions that we're talking about, or like the people that are facing, you know, like structural violence. Like these words do not leave this round. So that would be kind of that affirmative's answer. So undercommons is our second literature base. Pretty like generic topic link is the idea that like centering the USFG in our arguments and in our understanding of like political problems and changes that might need to be made, edges out modes of knowledge production that do not conform. So like other people have ideas, like people who are not, you know, policymakers on the Senate floor have thoughts about politics. The idea that we have to include the government in every single action that we take is the process by which academia calls certain forms of knowledge production more or less productive. The idea that productivity is something we should even be, you know, like championing is itself something that we should be questioning, right? And so instead, the advocacy that would be presented would either seek to kind of change the space and our relationship to knowledge production. So like, what does Debates Research Archive look like and how can we change that? Or potentially affirm the topic via a method that a traditional like Enlightenment framed academic would find threatening or unproductive, i.e. the undercommons, nomad politics. My affirmative this year was a queer archival practice as a method of rehistoricization, which was kind of both. So we were rehistoricizing the US-Japan alliance, which is kind of a symbolic reduction of alliance commitments, but then also was kind of a critical look at the way that Debates Research Archive accumulates you know, like a narrative that looks at international relations a certain way, and that way of looking at it is whitewashed and anti-queer. So generally, this is all kind of coming back to refusing conformity and territorialization and complicity in those systems. And again, these like molar formations that require the evisceration of the other. So some answers: structuralism, good. I.e. we should use structures of power that exist, and those things create order and peace. Questioning whether or not peace is actually being created is a pretty good answer. Also, whether or not they are inevitable is very much implicated in the way that academia and epistemology overdetermine our ability to make predictions about the future? So like, can we even visualize a world that does not have these things? Is that not completely tied to the way that we understand knowledge production? The next is seeds of the political. This is a very common argument, and the answer is also pretty common, that the political is already seeded by those who are socially dead and not granted the ability to make these changes. This also is something that is easily expanded on, in that like, they're saying, if they might say that we should be policymakers, we should learn how to do this, we should get elected. And the answer is, can we? Is everybody even allowed to run for office with the same kind of validity? And are those systems not unquestionable to a like kind of social formation that doesn't allow the people who are being discriminated against to speak out via the system that exists to speak out? If to answer these from a more critical perspective, or to answer this from a more critical perspective, like pessimism would criticize the idea that there can be an underneath, or kind of anything that is not already overdetermined, and that a theorization that believes those things might be true cannot contend with ontological formations, things like social death. So the answer to this is that potentially, like, maybe we need a space for theorizing these things. Like, even if these things are true, we do not have a space to talk about them. So this might be a prerequisite or a justification for the permutation. Another good answer to this is like communities of care. If these things are inevitable, this kind of comes back to the idea of like sclerotic knowledge production, in which we should see not just what is, but what could be. So the last one of these is set call. And again, I'll clarify, this is a set call shell that contains a university K. There are definitely pieces I'm about to say that are not just the university K. So topic link, that's the first one. The United States is on stolen land. Any government action within that ignores the way that settler colonial violence structures reality, and the inevitability of that process if we continue to center those systems. So the topic might be treaty making, a settler move to innocence, another collection of narratives of suffering, which is when you start getting into the Academy K. The way that the university space, debate space, requires that certain kinds of suffering are talked about and constantly talked about, and talked about in a specific way that is palatable but not too palatable. And then you can have some more specific links as well that get more into the Academy K depending on the topic. Things like the education topic had really solid internal link structures for like the wardship programs that we were talking about. You might have a critique of linguistic imperialism. And so an advocacy for these things may be the undercommons. It might also be to refuse the topic, to give back the land, to create, there's a book called A Third University as Possible, so to create a site for Indigenous scholarship. And so some answers, the idea that there can be a space in the academy as it exists for other types of knowledge production, that we can fix it, we can reform this space. The answer is contained in the pain narratives, suffering narratives argument, which is like these ideas are allowed. They're just only allowed when they are productive in a way that the university and the state find to be permissible. Another one might be an over-essential, like that this is an over-essentialization of the way that academia is structured. So this kind of comes back into more of like the thesis level claims about the foundations of the academy. The last one is that we might work with these structures of power to make changes. So treaty making arguments are a good answer here. And then also the idea that like reform is not possible, that this system is not something that we can fix because it is built on violence. So there are kind of two more pieces here. So I just talked about all these things on the affirmative. I'm going to talk about them on the negative really quick. So there are two general subcategories of affirmative. So answering policy AFs. So it depends. This will also dictate like which critique you choose, right? Because if you've decided you want to read a university K, what AF you're answering will not just help you choose like things like your link and impact and alternative, etc. But for a lot of these will kind of determine which critique is like which version of the critique is the most competitive. So like a policy F, you're probably going to be, I mean, reading Baudrillard is incredibly competitive. It is a very direct critique of like the idea that information is useful, right? But it is a lot less like compelling than potentially using the undercommons to talk about alternative methods of knowledge production, right? You have a more material alternative explanation using that critique, as opposed to Baudrillard, which would say like, there is nothing else. So then you kind of run into these like, well, then shouldn't we just see what we can do anyway arguments? Like so it really depends like what kind of critique you want to go for a little bit and what kind of ground you're looking for. But pretty generally, the argument structure is like, we need to stop pretending that the debate space can spill up, or that like words can change this space or any space, or that we'll be policymakers. And also the idea that the approach of the AF, like the choice to fiat the government, is already overdetermined, not only by like kind of the subversive epistemic practices that these systems use, but also by like the availability of evidence. Like, of course, it's more within the literature to do something on IR, because that's what we're supposed to be writing about IR. That's what the university and the state have kind of made to be the norm. So like, why did they choose this AF in the first place? That's a good question to ask if this is the kind of critique you want to go for. To answer KAFs, this is kind of where your choice of critique becomes most important. Because for instance, if someone has read a Baudrillard AF and that AF is very pessimistic, you would probably be best going for a more optimistic version of the K to generate competition, etc. Again, when you get into things like, do you want to have an argument about competing theories of race? If you're hitting a critical race theory AF, like, what kind of debate do you want to have? Do you want to talk about the epistemology versus ontology debate and potentially read a set call? Or do you want to talk about competing explanations of how anti-Blackness operates and go for like Moten? You could have really just the optimism versus, I mean, again, depending on the AF, the optimism versus pessimism debate. And so if the AF is optimistic, you might go for Baudrillard's kind of pessimism. If the AF is pessimistic, you might go for Deleuze's optimism. So these are they are choices that everyone will have to make, but you should be kind of informed about the way that those literature bases interact. Again, so the kind of generic arguments, there's a cruel attachments and hollow hope argument. This is best read against kind of any AF that is talking about the subject in any way. So it's kind of disingenuous to qualify them as like identity AFs, but just like talking about people. And the reason for that is because a hollow hope or cruel attachments argument requires an investment in the idea that something is being made better for someone. So if someone's reading like, Baudrillard AF, psychoanalysis AF, it's like, okay, like who is cruelly attached to anything? Who's cruelly attached to what? So that becomes a lot more persuasive if you're like, this creates a cruel attachment to systems of linguistic engagement for a group that is already facing violence, and also impedes the ability to seek change in a way that is not limited by academic structures, right? And then again, the idea that the university cannot be saved, that the act of like using this space for its productive capacity or linguistic potential is violent and kind of it's again a hollow hope. So you can kind of look at how you want to position that a little bit. So I would answer questions if there were any, but instead I'm going to explain the activity. So we got our 3 literature bases here, or I guess, yeah, 3. So y'all will be broken into breakout rooms. That was redundant. Anyway, room 1, you should create a kind of very, very short, like bullet pointed shell of a Baudrillard AF with a focus on the Academy K. So you can use anything that was talked about. You don't need to create like evidence. It's really just like an outline. And then also a answer to like a set call AF from a Baudrillard perspective. So again, via the Academy K. And then it moves like that through the room. So room 2 is writing AF or reading a shortened version via Moten and Harney's critique, or kind of a combination of the undercommons theorists that we talked about, and answering the Baudrillard AF with that critique, and moving on to room 3, etc. These arguments would get really redundant if we were going to try to do like spar rounds or something. So instead, we're going to focus on kind of cross-ex. You can like, probably will have people read what they've written and have a mini cross-ex, read the answers, and move through the rooms. Okay, got one more slide, I think. Bonus, 2 more slides. So I've said a few times there are a lot of Academy Ks. So these are kind of the ones that I thought of off the top of my head. So disability studies often approaches the Academy in terms of accessibility. Critical race theory focuses a lot on the ways that academia is weaponized against Black folks, and also like kind of the way that Enlightenment era foundation of the human subject was used to perpetuate, propagate, create, etc. these violent anti-Black systems. Nietzsche's Academy K really comes back to this will to order that we already talked about, the idea that knowledge can be used to make sense of a world that is chaotic. Mao has also a very, I think, very interesting critique as well, that you cannot separate theory from praxis, and that the university is kind of the pinnacle of the prioritization of theory to like a point of excess. Queer theory I talked about a little bit in terms of like queer archival practices, queer death studies, the kind of dislodging of the idea that productivity and normativity and futurity are things that we should be prioritizing. And then also the ivory tower. This is classic, just that like we say fancy words instead of doing actual things, and we kind of edge out those individuals to whom those fancy words are not accessible. That was a very, very short TLDR of these ideas. And if anybody that is watching this lecture has any questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish about any of the things that I've said, feel free to reach out. I hope everybody enjoyed this kind of short dive into the Academy K and the undercommons, and good luck.